Some of the scariest unsolved mysteries began years ago and have become cold cases after investigations reach a dead end. But with recent advances in technology, especially in DNA identification, many of these old mysteries are being solved. In 2022, justice was finally brought to dozens of mysteries that span decades, giving closure to families and friends who may have been haunted by these mysterious disappearances. Number 5. Lillian De Chloe was an 89-year-old former teacher and nurse living in Pompano Beach, Florida. But on April 29, 1994, her niece visited her home and found it ransacked, with De Chloe on the floor unresponsive. For years, the question of who was responsible remained a creepy mystery, with no witnesses or suspects. Even in 2004, when the local crime lab recovered more DNA evidence from De Chloe's nightgown and started doing testing, there weren't any matches. What finally began to unravel the mystery was familial DNA. Although police were unable to match the nightgown DNA to anyone specifically, they were able to deduce that it belonged to a first-degree relative of a man who had served time in a Florida prison. They suspected the DNA may belong to the man's father, Johnny Mack Brown, who had passed away from natural causes in 2010. The police exhumed his remains, which provided the conclusive evidence. DNA from tissue samples and bone marrow matched the nightgown DNA. According to Brown's family, he was a Marine during the Vietnam War who struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder. But in an eerie twist, police found that in 1992, Brown's listed address was around the corner from De Chloe's house. Dave Towsley, a detective on the case, said the attack may have been a burglary gone wrong, based on the open drawers and other scattered belongings. The man had fallen on hard times and was homeless, which likely led him to break in the first place. At the time, he had not been linked to any other crimes, and that continued for the rest of his life. That explains why his DNA has never been found in the system. De Chloe's niece, a woman named June Nicholas, had been haunted by the tragedy for years. She said, quote, "I would lay in my bed and I would see her on the floor. But when these stunning discoveries were made in December of 2022, she made a statement to the sheriff's department saying, quote, 'I know wherever she is, she can sleep in peace.'" Almost 30 years after the original crime, closure has finally been brought to the family. Number 4. In the early morning hours of January 11th, 2017, sheriff's deputies from Fort Bend County in Texas investigated reports of a burning vehicle on a rural road behind George Ranch High School. When they arrived, the vehicle was fully engulfed in flames. After putting it out, they found human remains in the trunk of the car. The remains were unidentified for a few months, but an autopsy report revealed that there were wounds on the body from a weapon. That meant that whoever the remains belonged to, they had lost their life before the fire was set. In April, the body was identified as Lorraine Diaz, a 21-year-old woman from Houston with 2 children. Her mother described her as a very quiet and sweet young woman. Early on, police suspected the culprit was someone that Diaz knew. They were particularly interested in Johnny Ming Dang, a 33-year-old man who had once been Diaz's girlfriend. But there wasn't enough evidence to charge him at first, because the fire had eliminated many of the common types of forensics, like fingerprints. The Fort Bend County Crime Stoppers Board offered a $10,000 reward to bring the culprit to justice, which was double the usual reward due to the brutality of the crime. But new evidence came in the fall of 2022, after the sheriff's office reopened the case. While some of the details of the case remain unknown to the public, it's clear that they were able to recover more evidence with the help of 2 partners from the Texas Rangers. Dang was arrested on November 29th and held on a $500,000 bond, bringing justice to a scary mystery that had remained unexplained for almost 6 years. Number 3. A Canadian couple by the names of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg left for an overnight trip to Seattle, Washington on November 18, 1987. But when they didn't return home the next day, their families knew something was wrong. On the 24th, Van Queilenborg, who was 18, was found bound with plastic ties and unresponsive in a ditch by a rural road, which led investigators to suspect Cook, who was 20, as the killer. But both of their families denied the possibility, and 2 days later, they found Cook's body as well, almost 60 miles from his girlfriend. Police believed that the person responsible for these tragedies was taunting them, especially by leaving plastic ties and gloves in the van that the couple took. The suspect did leave DNA on the van, but it had no match on databases, despite the police's belief that the suspect had been incarcerated in the past. This likely suggested that the prison stay happened before collecting DNA from criminals was commonplace. In the months after the tragedy, the families of the victims received graphic cards describing what happened to the couple. It wasn't until 2010 that the writer was identified, but he was cleared of suspicion in the actual crime, meaning the real culprit was someone else. The truth began to first come out over 30 years after the original tragedy, when the genetic genealogist C.C. Moore was able to identify a suspect in 2 hours using DNA from Van Queilenborg's pants, and a process called snapshot DNA phenotyping. The man was William Earl Talbot II, a 24-year-old man who lived 7 miles from the site of Cook's body. To obtain DNA from Talbot to prove that it was him, the police tailed him and grabbed a paper cup that had fallen from his truck. It was a match and Talbot was arrested, but that wasn't the end of the story. Talbot's conviction was overturned because of jury bias, with a second trial planned. But on December 23, 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court reinstated the guilty verdict, ensuring that Talbot would remain in custody on 2 sentences of life imprisonment without parole. The scary mystery of what happened to the young couple has remained unsolved for decades. Luckily, with the help of revolutionary DNA testing technology, the families can now rest assured that the man who changed their lives will never hurt someone again. Number 2. On June 10, 1991, a 23-year-old woman lost her life at the Whitehall Motel in El Dorado, Arkansas. Her ex-boyfriend, James McAlphin, was responsible. Little information was known about the woman, but she was born in Virginia and had lived in many different states, including Kansas, Florida, Texas, and Arkansas. She was involved in street work and also seemed to be under suspicion for several crimes, including robberies. She was even a possible person of interest in the killing of Dwayne McCorkindale, a 27-year-old truck driver who had lost his life at a rest stop in 1998. For many years, it was impossible to identify the woman, who became known as Dorado Jane Doe. She used multiple names, including Mercedes, which is what her friends called her, and Cheryl Ann Wick, which was the name on her ID. In fact, when police contacted the real Wick family in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they put the police in touch with the real Cheryl Ann Wick, whose identity had been stolen by Dorado Jane Doe. It turned out that none of the names given to the woman were true, and all the other information they'd gotten was unreliable due to the woman's conflicting stories about her past and the places she had lived. From jail, McAlphin offered to share details of her identity in exchange for $4,000, but police have dismissed him as unreliable. So her identity remained a mystery for decades. But investigators Yolanda McClary, Jean Grier, and Michael Leclerc worked with lead detective Kathy Phillips over the years on DNA testing, refusing to let this case go. In 2019, a genealogist found a second cousin of the woman by comparing DNA using GED Match, an online service that gained attention for helping law enforcement identify a suspect in the Golden State Killer case. And then in 2022, Dorado Jane Doe's identity was finally confirmed. McClary, one of the investigators, published an article on her website revealing some information about the woman, whose first name was revealed to be Kelly. She kept Kelly's surname private out of respect for the family, but it's comforting to know that the memories of Dorado Jane Doe will not live on in anonymity forever. Number 1. In 2016, Sherry Papini was a stay-at-home mom living in Redding, California. But on November 2nd, 2016, Papini's husband Keith reported her missing, kicking off a strange mystery that was only really solved years later. A statewide search ensued, with Keith's friends starting a GoFundMe that raised $50,000. On Thanksgiving, 3 weeks later, Papini was found on a highway 146 miles away. She had multiple injuries, including ligature marks, bruises, rashes, and a brand of a Bible verse on her right shoulder. She told a story about how she had been kidnapped by 2 Hispanic women who chained her up in a closet for weeks and branded her, feeding her tortillas and rice and playing mariachi music. This set off alarm bells for some advocates who pointed out the anti-Latino racism and the stereotypical descriptions of these kidnappers. But the story Papini gave fell apart in 2022. Previously unidentified male DNA that had been found on her body was traced back to her ex-boyfriend, James Reyes. In March, prosecutors alleged that during the period that she was missing, Papini was actually staying with him at his home in Southern California. A cousin of Reyes also said that he saw her twice in the apartment. The ex-boyfriend confirmed to investigators that Papini had stayed with him, which was corroborated by phone records showing that the two had been in communication for years. She had told Reyes that she needed to escape from her abusive husband, though in reality, Keith Papini had never harmed her. This meant that Papini had injured herself to make up evidence for the story of her kidnapping. She even asked Reyes to help out, including the branding. In April, Papini was charged with lying to federal officers and mail fraud. In September, she pleaded guilty to 1 count each and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. According to prosecutors, the hoax had cost taxpayers more than $300,000 in wasted resources. Friends of the family felt betrayed, with one local resident saying the news felt like a slap in the face. The Latino community was also vindicated after learning that the disturbing story of 2 armed Latina kidnappers wasn't true. When Papini's defense attorney was asked about why she did what she did, he said he didn't know, and even Papini herself might not know. In a statement, she said, quote, "I'm deeply ashamed of myself for my behavior, and so very sorry for the pain I've caused my family, my friends, all the good people who needlessly suffered because of my story, and those who worked so hard to try to help me. I will work the rest of my life to make amends for what I've done." Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.